Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them. Sometimes those chances come wrapped in dust and danger, testing everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Out in New Mexico territory, widow Eleanor McAllister owned more land and cattle than most folks could dream of. She also owned a black stallion named Diablo that had thrown 30 cowboys and sent them packing. When a poor, quiet cowboy rode into town and took her dare, everyone figured he'd be number 31. But this stranger had something the others didn't: patience, pain in his eyes, and secrets he wouldn't share. What made him different from all the rest? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Esperanza sat like a weathered coin in the palm of the New Mexico territory. Its adobe buildings baked the color of old leather under an unforgiving sun. Dust devils danced between the ramshackle structures, carrying with them the hopes and broken dreams of folks who'd come west looking for something better and found mostly hardship instead. At the center of it all stood the Broken Wheel Saloon, where Murphy O'Brien served whiskey that could strip paint and beer that tasted like it had been filtered through a horse blanket. The place smelled of sawdust, sweat, and the particular desperation that comes from men who've gambled away their last silver dollar on a horse that couldn't outrun a three-legged mule. Doc Henderson sat at his usual corner table, nursing a glass of Murphy's least offensive bourbon, while his weathered hands shuffled a deck of cards that had seen more action than most of the cowboys who frequented the establishment. His grey beard was stained yellow from years of tobacco, and his eyes held the weary wisdom of a man who'd sewn up more bullet holes than he cared to count. "Another one rode out this morning," Murphy said, wiping down a glass with a rag that had seen cleaner days. "That makes 30. Sheriff Martinez looked up from his own drink, his badge catching the lamplight. 30 good men, each one thinking he was the one who could break that devil horse. He shook his head slowly. "Pride's a powerful thing, but it ain't stronger than 1,500 pounds of pure meanness." The subject of their conversation lived 3 miles outside town on the sprawling McAllister Ranch, where Eleanor McAllister ruled her domain with the iron will of a woman who'd learned early that the world would take everything from her if she showed even a moment's weakness. Her husband had been dead near 2 years now, and while some folks whispered that she'd grieved too little and recovered too quickly, those who knew her understood that Eleanor had been carrying the weight of the ranch long before Chester McAllister drew his last breath. The ranch house sat on a rise, overlooking 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, its white-painted walls stark against the brown landscape. Eleanor had built it herself after the fire that claimed the original homestead, designing every room with the methodical precision of a woman who'd learned to depend on no one but herself. Wide porches wrapped around the structure, offering shade and a commanding view of the territory that stretched to the horizon in every direction. But it was the corral behind the house that drew the most attention from visitors, assuming they were brave enough or foolish enough to venture close. Built of timber thick as a man's waist and reinforced with iron bands, it stood 8 feet high and had been designed with one purpose in mind: to contain the black stallion that had become the stuff of legend throughout the territory. Diablo stood 17 hands high, his coat black as a moonless night, and his eyes holding the kind of wild intelligence that made grown men step back and reconsider their life choices. He'd been born on the ranch, sired by a Mustang stallion that had somehow jumped the fence and gotten to one of Eleanor's prize mares. From the moment he could stand, the colt had shown a spirit that couldn't be broken by conventional means. Chester McAllister had tried first, using the harsh methods he'd learned from his father. The result had been a horse that would tolerate no man's touch and a series of injuries that left 3 ranch hands permanently scarred. After Chester's death, Eleanor had issued her challenge to anyone fool enough to think they could succeed where others had failed. The rules were simple: spend 1 month with the horse, use whatever methods you deemed fit, and if you could ride him around the corral 3 times without being thrown, you'd earn $100 and the respect of everyone in the territory. If you failed, you'd join the growing list of men who'd learned that some things in this world couldn't be conquered by force alone. 29 men had tried and failed, each one leaving a little more battered and a lot more humble than when they'd arrived. They'd used whips and spurs, ropes and chains, kindness and cruelty in equal measure. The result was always the same. Diablo would rear and buck and fight until his challenger gave up or got thrown so hard they couldn't get back up. The morning of the 30th attempt had dawned clear and hot, with the kind of merciless sun that made even the lizards seek shade. Eleanor had watched from her porch as Jake Morrison, a gunslinger from Texas with a reputation for breaking horses and men with equal skill, strutted into the corral with his chest puffed out and his spurs jangling. Diablo had put him in the dirt 3 times in the first hour, and by noon Morrison was limping towards town with his tail between his legs and his pride in tatters. Eleanor had felt a mixture of satisfaction and disappointment as she watched him go. Part of her wanted to see the horse broken, to prove that everything could be conquered with enough determination. But another part of her, the part that understood what it meant to be cornered and fighting for survival, respected Diablo's refusal to surrender. That evening, as the sun painted the sky the color of fresh blood, Eleanor sat on her porch with a glass of wine and wondered if she'd ever find a man capable of understanding what it meant to earn trust rather than demand submission. The thought had barely formed in her mind when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon, small at first but growing larger as it approached. The rider who emerged from the gathering dusk was nothing like the others who'd come before. Where they'd been loud and boastful, he was quiet and still. Where they'd ridden fine horses with expensive saddles, he sat astride a plain brown mare with a saddle that had seen better decades. His clothes were clean but worn, his hat pulled low over eyes that seemed to hold secrets he wasn't ready to share. He rode up to the porch with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than on the ground, dismounting with a fluid motion that spoke of years of practice. When he removed his hat, Eleanor saw a face that had been carved by experience and weathered by grief lines around the eyes that came from squinting into too many sunsets, a mouth that seemed more accustomed to silence than words. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of someone who'd learned early that loud talk was usually empty talk. "I heard tell you've got a horse that needs understanding." Eleanor studied him from her chair, noting the way he stood balanced and alert without being aggressive, the way he held his hat respectfully but not subserviently. "I've got a horse that sent 30 men packing," she replied. "What makes you think you'll be any different?" The stranger's eyes met hers then, and Eleanor saw something there that the others had lacked. It wasn't arrogance or bravado or the kind of desperate need to prove something that drove most men to her door. It was something quieter and deeper, a recognition of pain that matched her own. "Maybe I won't be," he said simply, "but I'd like the chance to find out." Eleanor rose from her chair, her wine glass forgotten. "What's your name, Cowboy?" "Tom Brennan, ma'am, and I've got nowhere else to be." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eleanor McAllister found herself nodding slowly. "Well, Tom Brennan, you can bed down in the bunkhouse tonight. Tomorrow, you can meet Diablo properly, but I'll warn you, No is not like other horses. He's got a memory like an elephant and a temper like a rattlesnake." Tom settled his hat back on his head and gathered his mare's reins. "Ma'am, I've learned that the most worthwhile things in life are usually the hardest to come by. Sometimes the wildest hearts just need someone who's willing to listen." Eleanor watched him lead his horse toward the barn, something stirring in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. As she turned to go inside, she caught sight of Diablo standing at the far end of his corral, his dark form silhouetted against the star-filled sky. For just a moment, it seemed like the stallion was watching the new arrival, with something that might have been curiosity rather than hostility. She shook her head at such fanciful thinking and went inside to prepare for what she suspected would be either the most interesting month of her life or the most disappointing. Either way, she thought as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Tom Brennan was certainly different from the others. In the bunkhouse, Tom spread his bedroll on the narrow cot and sat on the edge, staring out the window toward the corral where Diablo waited. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a small leather pouch that held the only photograph he owned, a picture of a woman with kind eyes and a little girl with pigtails, both smiling at the camera with the innocent happiness of people who believed the world was a safe place. He traced the faded image with one finger, whispering a prayer to the darkness that tomorrow would bring him one step closer to the kind of peace that had eluded him for so long. In the corral, Diablo nickered softly, and Tom allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, two broken souls might find a way to heal each other. Dawn broke over the McAllister ranch like a slow blessing, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful if Tom Brennan had been in the mood to appreciate such things. Instead, he stood at the corral fence, coffee cup in hand, studying the magnificent creature that had become his assignment and possibly his salvation. Diablo stood at the far end of the enclosure, his black coat gleaming in the morning light. Everything about the stallion spoke of power, barely contained the arch of his neck, the way his muscles rippled beneath his skin, the intelligence that burned in his dark eyes. This wasn't just a horse, Tom realized. This was a force of nature that had refused to be diminished by the countless men who'd tried to break his spirit. "He's something, isn't he?" Eleanor's voice came from behind him, soft but carrying easily in the still morning air. She approached with her own cup of coffee, wearing a simple brown dress that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. "My husband said he was the devil himself, come to earth to test men's souls." Tom glanced at her, noting the way she held herself, proud but not arrogant, strong but not brittle. "What do you think he is?" Eleanor considered the question, her gaze fixed on Diablo. "I think he's a creature that's never been shown kindness without expecting pain to follow. Makes him dangerous, but it also makes him honest. You know exactly where you stand with him." Tom nodded slowly, understanding something in her words that went beyond horses. "How long has he been like this?" "Since he was weaned. Chester tried to break him the old way with force and dominance. Only made him wilder." Eleanor's voice carried old pain, and Tom suspected she wasn't just talking about the horse. "Every man who's tried since then has used the same methods. Whips, spurs, fear. They all expect him to submit because they're bigger and stronger. But submission earned through fear isn't really submission at all," Tom observed, his voice thoughtful. "It's just survival wearing a mask." Eleanor turned to study him, something sharp and curious in her eyes. "Most men don't understand that distinction." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on Diablo. The stallion had moved closer, drawn perhaps by the different energy of this new human. Where the others had approached with aggression or bravado, Tom simply stood still, letting the horse take his measure. "I'd like to try something different," Tom said finally, "if you're willing." Eleanor's laugh held no humor. 30 men have tried something different, Mr. Brennan. What makes you think your approach will work where theirs failed?" Instead of answering directly, Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small harmonica, its silver surface worn smooth by years of handling. He'd carried it through campaigns and cattle drives, through the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and the only company was memory and regret. "Music?" Eleanor's voice held skepticism. "Among other things." Tom lifted the harmonica to his lips and began to play a slow, mournful melody that seemed to capture all the loneliness of the vast territory around them. The notes hung in the air like a prayer, and something remarkable happened. Diablo's ears pricked forward, and the tension in his body seemed to ease slightly. The stallion moved closer to the fence, his steps careful but no longer aggressive. Tom continued playing, his eyes closed, pouring years of pain and hope into the simple melody. When the song ended, both Tom and Eleanor looked at Diablo in amazement. The horse stood less than 10 feet away, his head tilted slightly as if waiting for more music. It was the closest he'd allowed any human to come without showing signs of agitation. "Well, I'll be damned," Eleanor whispered. Tom slipped the harmonica back into his pocket and approached the fence slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice carrying the same gentleness as his music. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Not anymore." Diablo's eyes followed Tom's every movement, but there was no fear in them, now only a wary curiosity. When Tom reached the fence, he simply stood there, not reaching out, not demanding anything. He waited. For several minutes, man and horse regarded each other across the wooden barrier. Then, slowly, Diablo stretched his neck forward until his nose was inches from Tom's hand. The stallion's breath was warm against Tom's palm, and Tom could feel the tremor of muscles ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. "That's it," Tom said softly. "You decide how close you want to get." Eleanor watched in fascination as Tom simply stood there, letting Diablo set the pace. It was the opposite of everything she'd seen before. Instead of demanding submission, Tom was offering respect. Instead of trying to dominate, he was inviting partnership. After what felt like an eternity, Diablo took a step back, but there was no panic in the movement. He retreated to the center of the corral and stood watching Tom with something that might have been interest rather than hostility. "How did you?" Eleanor began, but Tom was already moving away from the fence. "That's enough for today," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Trust isn't built in a morning. It's earned one moment at a time." Eleanor followed him as he walked toward the barn, her mind racing with questions. The others tried to get on him the first day. Some of them managed it, at least for a few seconds. Tom paused at the barn door, his hand resting on the weathered wood. "Getting on a horse isn't the same as riding him, Mom, and riding him isn't the same as partnering with him. I'm not looking to break Diablo's spirit, I'm hoping to earn his trust." Something in his tone made Eleanor study his face more carefully. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of loss, a set to his mouth that suggested he'd learned hard lessons about the difference between force and strength. "What happened to you?" she asked suddenly. "What made you understand things the others didn't?" Tom's expression grew distant, and Eleanor saw him retreat behind walls that had been built by experience and reinforced by pain. "I learned that some things can't be fixed with force," he said quietly, "and that sometimes the things we think are broken are just protecting themselves the only way they know how." He turned to go into the barn, then paused. "Mrs. McAllister, I'll need to spend time with Diablo every day, just being present. Not trying to accomplish anything specific, just letting him get used to me. It might look like nothing's happening, but trust is invisible until it's tested," Eleanor finished, surprising herself with the understanding in her voice. Tom nodded, and for the first time since his arrival, Eleanor saw something that might have been a smile ghost across his features. "Yes, Mom, exactly that." As Tom disappeared into the barn to tend to his mare, Eleanor remained at the corral fence, watching Diablo pace restlessly in the morning sun. For the first time in 2 years, she felt something stir in her chest, not hope, exactly, but a curiosity about what might be possible when someone approached an impossible situation with patience instead of force. The saddle Tom pulled from his mare's back was a thing of beauty worn down by hard use. Every piece of leather had been shaped by thousands of miles, countless storms, and the kind of experiences that left their mark on both horse and rider. The horn was worn smooth by rope and reins, and the seat bore the impression of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than most people spent in their own beds. But it was the scratches on the cantle that caught Eleanor's attention, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws or bullets. When she asked about them, Tom's face went carefully blank. "Nothing important," he said, but Eleanor had heard enough lies in her lifetime to recognize the truth hiding behind his words. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and copper, Eleanor found herself thinking about the strange cowboy who'd ridden into her life with nothing but a worn saddle, a harmonica, and her approach to impossible problems that none of the others had tried. For the first time in years, she was genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. The second day began much like the first, with Tom standing at the corral fence nursing his coffee, while Diablo maintained his watchful distance. But this time, There was something different in the Ira, sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. Tom had risen before dawn, as was his custom, and spent the quiet hours before sunrise preparing for what he knew would be a long, slow process. He'd learned patience the hard way, through years of military service, where the difference between rushing and taking time could mean the difference between life and death. Now, watching Diablo move restlessly around the corral, he applied those same principles to a different kind of campaign. Eleanor emerged from the house carrying her own coffee, her hair pinned back in a practical bun that spoke of a woman who'd learned to value function over fashion. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd found strength in adversity. "Sleep well?" she asked, settling beside him at the fence. Tom nodded, though the truth was more complicated. His nights were rarely peaceful, filled as they were with dreams of flames and smoke, of voices calling his name from a distance he could never cross. But that wasn't something he felt inclined to share with a woman he'd known for less than 2 days. "He's watching you," Eleanor observed, gesturing toward Diablo with her cup. It was true. The stallion had positioned himself where he could observe Tom while maintaining his distance, his dark eyes tracking every movement. There was still wariness there, but the raw hostility of the previous day had been replaced by something that might have been curiosity. "Good," Tom said simply. "Means he's thinking instead of just reacting." Eleanor found herself studying Tom's profile as he watched the horse. There was something about the way he held himself, a stillness that spoke of hard-won discipline, an alertness that suggested he'd learned to be aware of danger without being consumed by it. His hands, she noticed, were steady and scarred, with the calluses of a man who'd worked with rope and leather and steel. "What did you do before this?" she asked. "Before you became a cowboy?" Tom's expression didn't change, but Eleanor saw something tighten around his eyes. "This and that," he said, which wasn't really an answer at all. Eleanor recognized the deflection. She'd used similar tactics herself when people asked about her marriage to Chester. Some wounds were too deep to be shared with casual conversation, and some truths were too painful to speak aloud. "I was married once," she said instead, surprising herself with the admission. "For 8 years." Tom glanced at her, waiting. "People in town think I didn't grieve him properly, that I moved on too quickly after he died." Eleanor's voice was steady, but Tom could hear the steel beneath the words. "They don't understand that I'd already done my grieving while he was alive." Tom nodded slowly, understanding more than she might have expected. "Some marriages are about companionship," he said quietly. "Others are about survival." The simple statement held such recognition that Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. For 2 years, she'd carried the weight of other people's judgment about her reaction to Chester's death. Here was someone who understood, without needing explanations. "What about you?" she asked. "Were you married?" Tom's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where Eleanor could see the outline of something small and flat beneath his shirt. "Once," he said, and the single word carried such weight that Eleanor knew not to push further. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching Diablo pace his domain. The stallion seemed to be conducting his own assessment, circling the corral at a measured pace that allowed him to observe his human audience from multiple angles. "I think I'll try something," Tom said finally, setting down his coffee cup. Eleanor watched as he walked slowly toward the barn, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. When he returned, he carried a brush and a small bucket of oats. Instead of approaching the corral directly, he settled himself on a stump about 15 feet away and began cleaning the brush with methodical precision. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked. "Showing him that I'm not in a hurry," Tom replied, not looking up from his work, "that I'm willing to be patient." Diablo had noticed the change in routine. The stallion moved closer to the fence, his head held high and alert. Tom continued his work, occasionally glancing at the horse, but never making direct eye contact in a way that might be interpreted as a challenge. After several minutes, Tom began to hum not a recognizable tune, but a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to resonate in the still morning air. Diablo's ears pricked forward, and his circling slowed to a stop. "He likes music," Eleanor observed. "Most horses do," Tom said, still focused on the brush. "It's about rhythm and vibration. Horses are prey animals. They're always listening for danger. Music tells them that everything's calm." Eleanor found herself drawn into the peaceful rhythm of the moment. There was something soothing about watching Tom work, about the way he moved with such economy and purpose. She'd grown up around men who believed that strength meant loudness, that dominance meant intimidation. Tom's quiet confidence was something entirely different. "Tell me about your husband," Tom said softly, still brushing. Eleanor was quiet for so long that Tom thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Chester was a hard man," she said. "Hard on the land, hard on the animals, hard on people. He saw everything as something to be conquered or controlled. When I was young, I thought that was strength. It took me years to understand that real strength doesn't need to prove itself every day." Tom nodded, still humming. "What changed your mind?" Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her left ring finger, where she still wore her wedding band, but Tom noticed that she'd turned it around, so the diamond faced her palm instead of showing to the world. "I watched him try to break a Mustang once," she said. "Beautiful animal, spirit like nothing I'd ever seen. Chester was determined to make it submit, used every brutal method he could think of. In the end, he broke its spirit completely. The horse lived, but there was nothing left of what had made it special." She paused, her gaze fixed on Diablo. "I realized I didn't want to become like that horse, broken and hollow, just going through the motions of living." Tom set down the brush and looked at her directly for the first time that morning. "So you didn't let him break you?" It wasn't a question, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at the quiet certainty in his voice. "I learned to protect the parts of myself that mattered," she said. "Built walls where I needed them, kept my real thoughts and feelings safe." "Lonely way to live," Tom observed. Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "Lonely, but alive. And after he died, I found I quite liked being able to make my own decisions, speak my own mind." Tom picked up the bucket of oats and stood slowly. "Independence is a precious thing once you've tasted it." As he spoke, he moved closer to the corral, but still maintained his distance from the fence. Diablo watched his approach with interest rather than alarm. When Tom was about 10 feet away, he stopped and sat down on the ground, the bucket beside him. "What now?" Eleanor asked. "Now we wait," Tom said, "and we let him decide what comes next." Eleanor watched in fascination as Tom simply sat there, occasionally reaching into the bucket and letting oats fall through his fingers. The sweet smell of the grain carried on the morning breeze, and Diablo's nostrils flared as he caught the scent. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the stallion began to move closer to the fence. His steps were careful, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat, but he was moving forward rather than away. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured, his voice carrying the same gentleness as his music. "Nobody's going to rush you. We've got all the time in the world." Eleanor found herself holding her breath as Diablo approached the fence. The stallion's ears were forward, his posture alert but not aggressive. When he was close enough to the fence to stretch his neck over it, he stopped and stood very still. Tom remained motionless, letting Diablo study him. The stallion's dark eyes seemed to be taking in everything: Tom's posture, his scent, the way he breathed. Finally, Diablo stretched his neck forward and sniffed delicately at the bucket of oats. "That's it," Tom said softly. "You decide how close you want to get." Eleanor watched in amazement as Diablo actually took a step closer to the fence. The stallion was close enough now that Tom could have reached out and touched him, but he made no move to do so. Instead, he picked up a handful of oats and held them out in his palm, his arm extended but not reaching toward the horse. For a long moment, stallion and man regarded each other across the small distance that separated them. Then, with infinite care, Diablo stretched his neck forward and delicately lipped the oats from Tom's palm. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the simple miracle of it. In all the months since Chester's death, she'd never seen Diablo allow any human to feed him by hand. The gentle touch of the horse's mouth against Tom's palm seemed to represent something larger than mere progress with a difficult animal. "Well done," she whispered. Tom remained perfectly still as Diablo finished the oats, then withdrew to a safe distance. The stallion didn't retreat to the far end of the corral this time, but stood about halfway across, watching Tom with what seemed like thoughtful consideration. "That's enough for today," Tom said, rising slowly and brushing the oat dust from his hands. "Trust has to be earned in small steps." As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor found herself thinking about the parallels between what she'd just witnessed and her own slow journey toward trusting again. Like Diablo, she'd learned to be wary of those who approached too quickly, demanded too much, or expected submission without offering respect in return. "Tom," she said as they reached the porch. He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip her, recognition of shared experience, of understanding earned through pain. "Thank you," she said simply. Tom nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "It's early days yet, ma'am, but I think we're off to a good start." As he walked toward the bunkhouse, Eleanor remained on the porch, her wedding ring catching the morning light. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering what it might be like to turn that ring around again, to let the diamond face the world instead of hiding against her palm. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, but she didn't push it away. Some changes, she was learning, had to happen in their own time, earned through patience and respect rather than force. By the end of the first week, Tom had established a routine that seemed to work for both him and Diablo. Every morning, he would arrive at the corral with his coffee and his bucket of oats, settling into the same spot on the ground while the stallion watched from a safe distance. The process was slow and methodical, but Eleanor could see the subtle changes in both man and horse. Diablo no longer retreated to the far end of the corral when Tom approached. Instead, the stallion would position himself about 20 feet away, close enough to observe, but far enough to maintain his sense of safety. Tom, for his part, seemed to understand the delicate balance required, never pushing for more than the horse was willing to give. On this particular morning, Eleanor found herself watching from the kitchen window as Tom went through his routine. She'd taken to observing these sessions, though she tried to be discreet about it. There was something compelling about the quiet drama playing out in her corral, two wary creatures, slowly learning to trust each other. Sheriff Martinez had ridden out the previous evening, ostensibly to check on how things were progressing, but Eleanor suspected he was driven more by curiosity than official duty. He'd sat on the porch with her, watching Tom work with Diablo, and had made an observation that had stuck with her. "That cowboy's got military bearing," Martinez had said, his experienced eye taking in Tom's posture and movements. "Seen it before in men who've been to war. They carry themselves different always, alert, always ready." Eleanor had pressed him for details, but Martinez had shrugged. "Just a feeling, something about the way he moves, the way he scans the horizon. Could be wrong, but I'd bet money he's seen action somewhere." The conversation had left Eleanor with more questions than answers. Tom Brennan was proving to be a man of layers, each one more intriguing than the last. She found herself wondering about his past, about the experiences that had shaped him into someone who understood patience and trauma in ways that the other cowboys hadn't. As if summoned by her thoughts, Tom appeared at the kitchen door, his hat in his hands and a hesitant expression on his face. "Ma'am, I was wondering if I might ask a favor," he said. Eleanor set down her coffee cup and turned to face him. "Of course. What do you need?" "I'd like to try something different with Diablo today, but I'll need your permission first." Tom's voice carried a note of uncertainty that Eleanor hadn't heard before. "I want to bring my harmonica into the corral with me." Eleanor considered this. "You think he'll let you get that close?" "I think he might," Tom said carefully, "but I won't know unless I try, and I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with it first." Eleanor studied his face, noting the way he held himself respectful, but not subservient, confident, but not arrogant. It struck her that he was asking for her permission, not because he had to, but because he wanted to include her in the process. "I trust your judgment," she said, and was surprised by how much she meant it. Tom's smile was brief but genuine. "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know." As they walked toward the corral together, Eleanor found herself thinking about trust and how it was built. Chester had demanded her trust as his due, had expected it without earning it. Tom, by contrast, seemed to understand that trust was something precious that had to be offered freely to have any value. Diablo was waiting for them, positioned in his usual spot about 20 feet from the fence. The stallion's ears were forward, his posture alert but no longer defensive. Eleanor noticed that the horse's attention was focused entirely on Tom, as if he'd come to associate the man's presence with something positive. Tom moved slowly toward the corral gate, his movements deliberate and calm. Eleanor had watched enough of these sessions to recognize the careful choreography and vulva-divery gesture calculated to communicate safety and respect rather than dominance or threat. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured as he unlatched the gate. "Just me, same as always." Eleanor held her breath as Tom stepped into the corral for the first time. This was the moment when most of the other cowboys had been thrown, when Diablo's fight-or-flight instincts typically kicked in. But the stallion simply watched, his dark eyes tracking Tom's every movement without panic. Tom stopped about 10 feet inside the gate and slowly lowered himself to the ground, assuming the same position he'd taken for the past week. The only difference was that now there was no fence between him and 1,500 pounds of potentially dangerous horse. "Smart," Eleanor whispered to herself, recognizing the wisdom in Tom's approach. By maintaining the same routine, he was showing Diablo that nothing fundamental had changed, despite the absence of the barrier. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out his harmonica, holding it where Diablo could see it clearly. The stallion's ears pricked forward with interest, and Eleanor could swear she saw recognition in the horse's eyes. The first notes that emerged from the harmonica were soft and low, barely audible above the morning breeze. Tom played the same melody he'd used on that first day, but now it seemed to carry additional weight, the accumulated trust of their daily encounters. Diablo moved closer. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the deliberate steps of a creature making a conscious choice. Eleanor watched in fascination as the stallion closed the distance between himself and Tom, stopping when he was close enough that his breath stirred the dust at Tom's feet. Tom continued playing, his eyes closed, completely focused on the music. Eleanor realized that this was an act of tremendous faith on his part, sitting defenseless within striking distance of a horse that had injured 30 men, trusting that the relationship they'd built was strong enough to protect him. When the melody ended, Tom opened his eyes to find Diablo standing directly in front of him, the stallion's head lowered in a posture that Eleanor had never seen before. There was something almost reverent about the way the horse stood, as if he understood that something significant was happening. "Hello, friend," Tom said softly, his voice carrying the same gentleness as his music. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Diablo slowly extend his neck, bringing his muzzle close to Tom's face. For a moment, man and horse simply breathed the same air, separated by inches but connected by something deeper than proximity. Then, with infinite care, Tom raised his hand and gently touched Diablo's neck. The stallion's skin trembled under the contact, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he seemed to lean into the touch, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to offer him kindness without expecting anything in return. Eleanor had to cover her mouth to stifle a sob. After watching 30 men try and fail to dominate this magnificent creature, she was witnessing something far more powerful the moment, when trust conquered fear, when patience triumphed over force. Tom's hand moved slowly along Diablo's neck, his touch light and respectful. He was whispering something too soft for Eleanor to hear, but whatever he was saying seemed to calm the stallion even further. "Well, I'll be damned," a voice said behind Eleanor, causing her to jump. She turned to see Jake Morrison leaning against the fence, his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. Jake was one of the local ranch hands who'd tried and failed to break Diablo several months earlier, and Eleanor could see that witnessing Tom's success was not sitting well with him. "Looks like your tame cowboy's got some kind of trick," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of derision. "Wonder how long it'll last when he tries to actually ride the beast." Eleanor bristled at the dismissive tone. "It's not a trick, Jake. It's skill." Jake snorted. "Any fool can pet a horse, Eleanor. The real test is when you try to put a saddle on him. That's when we'll see what your boy's really made of." As if summoned by Jake's words, Tom slowly rose to his feet. Diablo watched the movement with interest, but no alarm, and Tom was able to step back toward the gate without causing the stallion to retreat. "That's enough for today," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Some things can't be rushed." Jake pushed away from the fence with obvious disgust. "Mark my words, Eleanor. When push comes to shove, that horse is going to put your pet cowboy in the dirt, same as he did the rest of us. All this gentle nonsense is just delaying the inevitable." As Jake stalked away, Eleanor found herself angry in a way she hadn't been in years. There was something about his dismissive attitude that reminded her of Chester, of the way her late husband had sneered at anything that didn't involve force or dominance. "Don't mind Jake," Tom said as he joined her outside the corral. "Some folks can't understand that there's more than one way to solve a problem." Eleanor studied his face, noting the calm acceptance in his expression. "Doesn't it bother you, having people think you're wasting your time?" Tom was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on Diablo, who had moved to the center of the corral, but was still watching them with interest rather than hostility. "I learned a long time ago that other people's opinions don't change what's true," he said finally. "Diablo and I know what's happening between us. That's what matters." As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor found herself thinking about the hidden strength in Tom's approach. There was something profoundly masculine about his willingness to be patient, to earn rather than demand, to build rather than break. It was so different from everything she'd experienced with Chester that it made her reassess her understanding of what real strength looked like. "Tom," she said as they reached the porch. He turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her heart flutter, a warmth that hadn't been there when he'd first arrived. "Would you like to join me for dinner tonight? I mean, in the house rather than the bunkhouse. I'd like to hear more about your methods." Tom's smile was slow but genuine. "I'd be honored, Mom." As he walked toward the barn to tend to his mare, Eleanor remained on the porch, her hand unconsciously moving to her wedding ring. For the first time since Chester's death, she found herself looking forward to sharing a meal with a man not out of obligation or duty, but because she genuinely wanted his company. That evening, as Eleanor prepared dinner in her kitchen, she found herself taking extra care with her appearance. She told herself it was simply a matter of proper hospitality, but the truth was more complicated. Something about Tom Brennan had awakened feelings she'd thought were buried forever, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with them. When Tom arrived at her door, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt, Eleanor felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with possibility. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. As Tom crossed the threshold of her home, Eleanor realized that she was allowing him into more than just her house. For the first time in years, she was opening her life to someone who might actually understand what it meant to heal rather than simply survive. Hidden in his saddlebag in the bunkhouse, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected from the dust and weather, lay a small metal object that Tom hadn't looked at in over a year. The Congressional Medal of Honor bore his name and the date of a battle he wished he could forget, a reminder of the leadership and courage he'd shown in saving his unit while losing everything that had mattered to him personally. He'd been a captain then, responsible for 32 men who'd trusted him with their lives. He'd brought 31 of them home, but the one he'd lost had been carrying a letter from Tom's wife. A letter that had burned along with everything else in the fire, that had claimed his family while he was half a world away. The medal was supposed to represent honor and valor, but to Tom it only represented the cruel irony of being celebrated for saving strangers while failing to protect the people he loved most. He'd never worn it, never displayed it, never spoken of it to anyone. It was simply there, a reminder of who he used to be before grief had stripped away everything except the need to keep moving forward. But sitting in Eleanor's warm kitchen, sharing stories and laughter over a simple meal, Tom found himself thinking that maybe it was time to stop running from his past and start building something new. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting what had been lost, but about finding the courage to risk caring again. As the evening shadows lengthened across the desert, two damaged souls continued their careful dance around the possibility of something more than mere survival, while in the corral outside, a black stallion stood watching the house with intelligent eyes, as if he understood that the real training was just beginning. 2 weeks into Tom's residency at the McAllister Ranch, the impossible began to seem merely improbable. Diablo not only tolerated Tom's presence in the corral, but actively sought it out, positioning himself near the gate each morning, as if waiting for his daily session with the quiet cowboy, who brought music and patience in equal measure. Eleanor had taken to watching these encounters from different vantage points around the ranch, partly out of genuine fascination, and partly because she found herself drawn to Tom's calm competence. There was something deeply appealing about watching a man who understood that real strength didn't need to announce itself, who could accomplish more with whispered words than others, managed with shouted commands. This morning brought a breakthrough that left Eleanor speechless. She watched from the kitchen window as Tom entered the corral carrying not just his harmonica and bucket of oats, but also a soft brush and a lead rope. The stallion's ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm, and when Tom sat in his usual spot, Diablo approached without hesitation. What happened next defied everything Eleanor thought she knew about her horse. Tom began by playing his harmonica, the familiar melody that had become Diablo's signal that all was well. Then, slowly and with infinite patience, he introduced the brush. First, he simply held it where Diablo could see and smell it, letting the stallion investigate this new element in their routine. When the horse showed no signs of distress, Tom began to use the brush on his own arm, demonstrating its purpose in a way that spoke of genuine understanding of horse psychology. "You see?" Tom murmured, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Nothing to fear, just another way to show care." Eleanor held her breath as Tom slowly reached out and touched the brush to Diablo's shoulder. The stallion's skin twitched at the contact, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he seemed to lean into the sensation as Tom began to gently brush his coat. For nearly an hour, Eleanor watched this intimate dance between man and horse. Tom worked with the brush slowly and methodically, talking softly to Diablo throughout the process. The stallion's entire demeanor had changed from the wild, defensive creature she'd known to something approaching domestication, not broken or subdued, but genuinely calm and trusting. When Tom finally stood and clipped the lead rope to Diablo's halter that the horse had been wearing for days now without protest, Eleanor had to sit down hard in her kitchen chair. The sight of her supposedly untamable stallion following Tom around the corral like a well-trained pet was almost too much to process. "How?" she whispered to herself, then realized she needed to ask the question directly. Eleanor made her way to the corral, arriving just as Tom was removing the halter from Diablo's head. The stallion stood quietly for the process, then moved a few steps away before turning back to watch Tom with what could only be described as affection. "I don't understand," Eleanor said without preamble. 3 weeks ago, that horse nearly killed Jake Morrison. Now he's following you around like a puppy." Tom coiled the lead rope with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. "It's not magic if that's what you're thinking. It's just patience and consistency." But the others tried patience. "No," Tom interrupted gently. "They tried not being violent, which isn't the same thing. Patience means accepting that the horse gets to set the timeline, not you. It means being willing to spend weeks just earning the right to touch him, rather than assuming you deserve it because you're human." Eleanor studied Tom's face, noting the lines around his eyes that seemed deeper today. "You're tired," she observed. Tom's smile was rueful. "Been having some trouble sleeping. Old habits." Eleanor wanted to ask about those old habits, about the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. But she'd learned that Tom, like Diablo, couldn't be pushed to reveal more than he was ready to share. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked instead. "I was about to put a fresh pot on." As they walked toward the house, Eleanor noticed that Tom moved with the same careful awareness he brought to everything else, scanning the horizon, noting the position of shadows, staying alert to his environment in a way that spoke of ingrained habit rather than conscious choice. In the kitchen, she busied herself with the coffee while Tom settled at her table. The domesticity of the moment struck her forcefully, how natural it felt to have him in her space, how right it seemed to be preparing coffee for someone whose company she genuinely enjoyed. "Tom," she said as she set his cup before him, "can I ask you something personal?" He looked up at her with those steady grey eyes, and Eleanor saw him weighing whether to retreat behind his usual walls. After a moment, he nodded. "Sheriff Martinez thinks you have military experience. Is he right?" Tom's hands stilled around his coffee cup, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. Not quite pain, but a recognition of pain that lived too close to the surface. "He's right," Tom said quietly. "Captain Thomas Brennan, United States Army, served 8 years, mostly overseas." Eleanor settled across from him at the table, sensing that this was important territory that required careful navigation. "What made you leave?" Tom was silent for so long that Eleanor began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I lost my family while I was deployed. House fire. My wife Sarah and our daughter Emma was only 6. His words came out flat and emotionless, but Eleanor could see the cost of speaking them in the way his knuckles went white around his cup. "Oh, Tom." Eleanor's heart broke for him, understanding now the source of the pain she'd seen in his eyes. "I'm so sorry." Tom nodded slowly. "I was leading a mission that saved 31 men, earned me a medal and a commendation. But I couldn't save the 2 people who mattered most." He looked up at Eleanor, and she saw raw honesty in his gaze. Been hard to see the point in much of anything since then. Eleanor reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way he held himself ready to pull away. "Is that why you understand Diablo? Because you know what it's like to be hurt?" "Maybe," Tom said, not pulling away from her touch. "Or maybe I just recognize another creature that's learned not to trust too easily." They sat in silence for a while, the morning sun streaming through the kitchen windows and warming the space between them. Eleanor found herself thinking about the strange parallel between her situation and Tom's, both of them trying to rebuild lives that had been fundamentally altered by loss. "The portrait," Eleanor said suddenly. Tom looked at her with confusion. "Ma'am?" "There was a portrait of Chester in the parlor. I moved it to storage last week." Eleanor's cheeks flushed slightly. "I'm not sure why I'm telling you this." Tom's expression softened. "Maybe because you're ready to stop living in the past." Eleanor looked down at her left hand, where her wedding ring caught the morning light. She'd been wearing it turned inward for so long that the gesture had become unconscious, but now she found herself aware of its weight and positioning. "It's frightening," she admitted. "The idea of caring about someone again, of being that vulnerable." Tom's thumb moved gently across her knuckles, and Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Frightening," he agreed, "but maybe worth the risk." Before either of them could say more, the sound of horses approaching drew their attention to the window. Eleanor looked out to see Jake Morrison riding up with 2 other men she didn't recognize, their faces set with the kind of grim determination that usually meant trouble. Tom was already rising from his chair, his entire demeanor shifting from gentle companionship to alert readiness. Eleanor noticed how quickly he'd assessed the situation, how his body language had changed to something more guarded and prepared. "Friends of yours?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Eleanor shook her head as she watched Jake dismount and stride toward the house with his companions in tow. "Jake's been stirring up trouble since you arrived. I think he's finally decided to do something about it." Tom moved to the window, positioning himself where he could see the approaching men while maintaining cover. The movement was so smooth and automatic that Eleanor realized this was how he'd stayed alive through whatever conflicts he'd faced during his military service. "Mrs. McAllister," Jake's voice carried clearly across the yard. "We need to talk." Eleanor looked at Tom, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand had moved unconsciously toward his hip, where she now noticed he wore a gun that she'd somehow missed before. "Stay inside," Tom said quietly. "Let me handle this." Eleanor bristled at the suggestion. "This is my ranch, Tom, my fight." Tom turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her understand why his men had followed him into battle. Sometimes the best way to protect what matters is to let someone else take the risks. Before Eleanor could argue further, Tom was moving toward the door, his steps silent and purposeful. As she watched him prepare to face whatever Jake Morrison had brought to her doorstep, Eleanor realized that her feelings for the quiet cowboy had moved far beyond simple attraction. She was falling in love with him, and the thought terrified her almost as much as the men gathering in her yard. Tom stepped onto the porch with the same measured calm he brought to everything else, but Eleanor could see the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of a man prepared for trouble. Jake Morrison stood 20 feet away with his two companions, flanking him hard cases with the look of men who solved problems with their fists rather than their brains. "Morning, Jake," Tom said pleasantly, settling his hat more firmly on his head. "Beautiful day for a ride." Jake's face twisted with barely controlled anger. "Cut the pleasantries, Brennan. We all know why I'm here." "Do we?" Tom's voice remained conversational, but Eleanor noticed how his stance had shifted slightly, his weight balanced and ready. "Why don't you enlighten me?" "You're making a fool of everyone in this territory with your horse, whispering nonsense." Jake spat. 30 good men tried to break that devil, and you come along with your soft talk and your music, and suddenly everyone thinks you're some kind of miracle worker." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "And that bothers you because?" One of Jake's companions, a stocky man with arms like tree trunks, stepped forward. "Because it makes the rest of us look weak," he growled, "like we didn't try hard enough." "Maybe you didn't," Tom said mildly, and Eleanor saw Jake's face flush red with anger. "You calling me a coward?" Jake's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and Eleanor felt her heart skip. Tom's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him, a sense of coiled readiness that made even Jake's companions take an unconscious step back. "I'm not calling you anything," Tom said, "but if you draw that gun, you'd better be prepared to use it, because I won't give you a second chance." The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they carried such absolute conviction that Jake's hand froze halfway to his weapon. Eleanor realized she was looking at a different Tom Brennan, not the gentle horseman who played music for Diablo, but the army captain who'd led men through combat and lived to tell about it. "This isn't over," Jake said, but his hand had moved away from his gun. "It is if you're smart," Tom replied. "Eleanor McAllister hired me to train her horse, and that's what I'm doing. If you don't like my methods, you're welcome to your opinion, but you're not welcome to interfere with my work." Jake's jaw worked as if he wanted to say more, but something in Tom's eyes seemed to discourage further conversation. After a long moment, he jerked his head toward his companions. "Come on," he muttered. "Let's get out of here." As the three men mounted their horses and rode away, Eleanor stepped onto the porch beside Tom. She could see the tension slowly leaving his shoulders, the careful alertness fading back to his normal, quiet watchfulness. "You've done that before," she said. Tom glanced at her. "Done what?" "Faced down armed men. You knew exactly how to handle that situation." Tom was quiet for a moment, watching the dust cloud raised by Jake's departure. "Some skills you never forget, even when you wish you could." Eleanor wanted to ask more, but the sound of horses approaching from the opposite direction drew their attention. This time, it was Sheriff Martinez riding alone, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "Morning, folks," Martinez called as he dismounted. "Past Jake Morrison and his boys on the road. They looked like they'd swallowed something sour." They stopped by to share their opinions about my training methods, Tom said dryly. Martinez nodded. Figured as much. That's actually why I'm here. He looked directly at Tom. Mind if I ask what unit you served with, Captain? Eleanor saw Tom go very still, and she realized that Martinez had just revealed he knew more about Tom's background than he'd let on. 3rd Infantry, Tom said quietly. How long have you known? Since the 2nd day you were here, Martinez replied. Had a feeling about you, so I sent some telegrams. Took a while to get answers, but they came back yesterday. He paused, his expression serious. Want to tell me why a Medal of Honor recipient is working as a ranch hand in the middle of nowhere? Eleanor's breath caught. Medal of Honor's highest military decoration for valor. She looked at Tom with new eyes, understanding now why he'd been so comfortable facing down Jake's threats. Because I don't want to be Captain Brennan anymore, Tom said, his voice flat. That man died with his family. Tom the Cowboy is all that's left. Martinez studied him for a long moment. Fair enough, but Jake Morrison's been talking to folks in town, stirring up trouble. Says you're using some kind of trickery to make fools of honest men. People are starting to listen. What kind of trouble? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew. The kind where a group of angry cowboys might decide to ride out here and prove that Diablo can't really be tamed. Martinez said grimly, the kind where someone might get hurt trying to prove a point. Tom's expression hardened. They'd be making a mistake. I know that, and you know that. But pride makes men stupid. Martinez replied, I'm just giving you a heads up. Might be wise to finish whatever you're doing with that horse sooner rather than later. After Martinez left, Eleanor and Tom stood on the porch in thoughtful silence. The peaceful morning had been shattered by reminders of the outside world and its complications, but Eleanor found herself more concerned about Tom than about any potential threats to the ranch. A Medal of Honor, she said finally. Tom's smile was bitter. Lot of good it did my family. Eleanor turned to face him fully, seeing the self-recrimination in his eyes. Tom, you can't blame yourself for what happened to them. Can't I? His voice was rough with emotion. I was their protector, their provider. I should have been there. You were serving your country, saving other people's families. While mine burned, Tom's hands clenched into fists. You want to know what I was doing when they died? I was pulling wounded men out of a burning building, being a hero, while my real job keeping my wife and daughter safe went undone. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his voice. Without thinking, she reached out and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Listen to me, Tom Brennan. What happened to your family was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. You can't be everywhere at once. You can't protect everyone all the time. Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts. Tom's eyes searched her face, and Eleanor saw something crack in his carefully constructed walls. How do you live with that kind of helplessness? The same way you do, Eleanor said softly. One day at a time. One small step toward healing. One moment of choosing to keep going, even when it hurts. Tom's hands came up to cover hers, and Eleanor felt the tremor in his fingers. I'm tired of running from it, he whispered. Then stop running, Eleanor said. Stay here. Build something new. For a moment, Tom leaned into her touch, and Eleanor thought she saw something like hope flicker in his eyes. Then, from the direction of the corral, came the sound of Diablo Nicaringa, gentle, questioning sound that seemed to be asking where his human had gone. Tom smiled despite himself. He's gotten used to our routine. So have I, Eleanor admitted, her hands still framing his face. Tom's eyes darkened, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, the careful friendship they'd been building, transforming into something deeper and more dangerous. When Tom's hands slid into her hair, Eleanor didn't pull away. When he leaned down to kiss her, she rose up to meet him. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative and questioning, but when Eleanor responded by pulling him closer, it deepened into something that spoke of long loneliness and the desperate hope of connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Eleanor, Tom said, his voice rough. I know, she whispered. I'm scared too. They might have said more, but the sound of Diablo's increasingly insistent nickering drew them back to the present. Tom stepped back reluctantly, his hands sliding down Eleanor's arms before releasing her entirely. "I should see to him," Tom said. Eleanor nodded, though part of her wanted to pull him back, to hold on to this moment of connection before the world could intrude again. "Tom," he turned back to her. "Whatever happens with Jake Morrison or anyone else, I want you to know I don't regret anything, not the horse, not you being here, not what just happened between us." Tom's smile was soft and genuine. "Neither do I." As Tom walked toward the corral where Diablo waited, Eleanor touched her lips, still feeling the warmth of the kiss. For the first time in years, she found herself thinking about the future with something approaching hope rather than resignation. Hidden in Tom's saddlebag, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected from the elements, lay the letter he'd never opened. It had arrived the day before his family died, postmarked from his hometown, written in Sarah's careful handwriting. He'd been saving it for a quiet moment that had never come, and after the fire, he'd been unable to face whatever loving words it contained. But standing in Eleanor's kitchen, feeling her touch and seeing acceptance in her eyes, Tom found himself thinking that maybe it was time to stop protecting himself from reminders of love. Maybe it was time to remember that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the past didn't require abandoning the future. As he approached Diablo's corral, Tom made a decision. Tonight, after the ranch was quiet and Eleanor was asleep, he would finally read Sarah's last letter. Not as an act of self-torture, but as a way of saying goodbye properly so he could say hello to whatever was growing between him and the remarkable woman who'd shown him that healing was possible. Diablo's greeting nicker seemed to approve of the decision, and Tom smiled as he reached for his harmonica. Some conversations, he'd learned, were best conducted in the language of music and trust. 3 days after the confrontation with Jake Morrison, Tom found himself making remarkable progress with Diablo. The Stallion not only accepted a saddle blanket, but actually seemed to enjoy the grooming sessions that had become part of their daily routine. Eleanor watched from the porch each morning, her coffee growing cold as she observed the growing bond between man and horse. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when Tom successfully placed a saddle on Diablo's back. The Stallion stood calmly while Tom adjusted the straps, showing none of the violent resistance that had characterized his interactions with previous trainers. When Tom stepped back to admire their progress, Diablo actually turned his head to nuzzle Tom's shoulder, a gesture of affection that left Eleanor speechless. "I think he's ready," Tom said as he joined Eleanor on the porch afterward. "Maybe not for a full ride yet, but ready for me to put weight in the stirrups, test his reaction to having someone lean across his back." Eleanor felt a mix of excitement and terror at the prospect. After weeks of watching Tom's patient approach yield impossible results, she was beginning to believe that he might actually succeed where 30 others had failed. But success would mean the end of their arrangement, and she wasn't ready to think about Tom leaving. "How much longer do you think you'll need?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Tom studied her face, and Eleanor had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her attempt at nonchalance. "Hard to say. Another week, maybe 2. Depends on how he handles the next few steps." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. 2 weeks felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Doc Henderson, who rode up in his old wagon with an expression that immediately put Eleanor on alert. Doc wasn't the type to make social calls, especially not in the middle of the day when he should have been tending to patients in town. "Eleanor, Tom," Doc said as he climbed down from his wagon, moving with the stiffness of a man whose joints had seen too many years. "Wondered if I might have a word." Eleanor gestured toward the porch chairs. "Of course, Doc. Can I get you some coffee?" Doc shook his head, settling heavily into one of the chairs. He looked tired, Eleanor thought, and older than his 67 years. "This isn't a social call, I'm afraid. Got something weighs heavy on my mind, and I've been wrestling with whether to speak up." Tom leaned against the porch railing, his posture relaxed but alert. What's troubling you, Doc? Doc Henderson looked between them, his weathered face creased with worry. It's about Chester, he said finally, about how he died. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. Chester's death had been ruled. An accident a horse had spooked during a card game in town. Chester had been kicked and died from his injuries. It had been sudden and traumatic, but not mysterious. What about Chester's death? Eleanor asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Doc pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, his hands trembling slightly. Jake Morrison came to see me last night, drunk as a skunk and carrying on about how you and Tom were making fools of everyone in the territory. He paused, looking directly at Eleanor. He was also carrying this. Eleanor took the paper with hands that had suddenly gone numb. It was a letter written in Jake's sprawling handwriting, obviously composed while under the influence of alcohol. But as she read the words, her blood turned to ice. The letter was a confessiona, rambling, guilt-ridden admission that Chester's death hadn't been an accident at all. According to Jake's drunken scrawl, Chester had been cheating at cards, and when he'd been caught, he'd drawn his gun. Jake, defending himself and the other players, had shot Chester dead. They'd staged the scene to look like a horse accident, bribing witnesses and falsifying evidence. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the final paragraph. I can't watch you play the grieving widow anymore, Eleanor. You know what kind of man Chester was. You know what he did to you behind closed doors. We thought we were doing you a favor, but watching you with that cowboy makes me think maybe we were just cowards who couldn't face the truth about what we'd done. The paper slipped from Eleanor's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the porch floor like a dying bird. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of Diablo moving restlessly in his corral, as if the stallion could sense the tension that had suddenly charged the air. Tom bent to retrieve the letter, scanning its contents quickly. Eleanor watched his face change as he read, saw the way his jaw tightened and his eyes went cold. When he finished, he looked up at Doc Henderson with an expression that made the older man shift uncomfortably. How long have you known? Tom asked, his voice deadly quiet. Doc's shoulders sagged. Suspected from the beginning. The injuries didn't match the story they told. Horse kick doesn't leave powder burns, and Chester had powder burns on his shirt. He looked at Eleanor with eyes full of regret. I should have spoken up then, but Jake and his friends had their stories straight, and frankly... He paused, struggling with the words. Frankly what? Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. Frankly, I thought you might be better off without him, Doc admitted. Everyone in town knew what kind of man Chester was, what he did to you when he'd been drinking. We all heard the excuses about falls and accidents, saw the bruises you tried to hide with powder and long sleeves. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her, not just because Chester had been murdered, but because everyone had known about the abuse and done nothing. Because they'd all stood by and watched her suffer, then celebrated her widowhood in silence. You all knew, she said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. You all knew he was hurting me, and you did nothing. Doc flinched as if she'd struck him. Eleanor, we thought. You thought what? That I deserved it? That it wasn't your business? Eleanor's voice was rising now, years of buried anger finally finding an outlet. You thought it was easier to let him beat me than to stand up to him. We thought you wouldn't leave him, Doc said miserably. We thought if we tried to intervene, he'd just hurt you worse. Tom's hands had clenched into fists, and Eleanor could see the effort it was taking him to remain still. So you let her suffer for 8 years, then covered up his murder to protect his killers. It wasn't like that, Doc began. That's exactly what it was like, Tom cut him off. You were all cowards, every last one of you. Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the porch floor. She felt nauseated, betrayed, and furious all at once. The life she'd built since Chester's death, the respect she'd earned in the community, the very foundation of her independence, all of it, was built on lies. Get out, she said quietly. Doc Henderson looked stricken. Eleanor, please. Get out, she screamed, her composure finally shattering. Get off my land and don't come back. Doc struggled to his feet, his face grey with shame. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I truly am. I thought you deserved to know the truth. The truth? Eleanor laughed bitterly. The truth is that everyone I trusted was a coward and a liar. The truth is that I've been living a lie for 2 years. As Doc's wagon disappeared down the dusty road, Eleanor sank into her chair, the full weight of the revelation crushing down on her. Everything she'd believed about her life, her freedom, her ability to trust her own judgment, all of it was crumbling. Tom knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle. "Eleanor, don't," she said, not looking at him. "Just don't. This doesn't change anything between us." Eleanor's laugh was harsh. "Doesn't it? My husband was a cheat and an abuser who was shot down like a dog in a card game. Everyone in town knew about it and said nothing. My wealth, my land, my independence, it's all built on blood, money, and lies." Tom was quiet for a moment, then reached out and gently touched her chin, turning her face toward him. "Your husband was those things, yes, but you're not responsible for his choices. And you're not less worthy of respect because he hurt you. You don't understand," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "I stayed with him. For 8 years I stayed and endured and made excuses. What kind of woman does that make me?" "A woman who was trying to survive," Tom said firmly. "A woman who was doing the best she could in an impossible situation." Eleanor shook her head. "I could have left. I had money. I had options." "Did you?" Tom's voice was gentle but insistent. "Or did he make sure you believed you didn't? Did he isolate you from friends, make you doubt your own judgment, convince you that no one would believe you or help you?" Eleanor stared at him, recognition dawning in her eyes. Because that was exactly what Chester had done, slowly and systematically, until she'd felt trapped and powerless despite her wealth and social position. "He was clever about it," she whispered, "made it seem like protection, like caring, told me the world was dangerous for women alone, that I needed him to keep me safe." "While he was the one you needed protection from," Tom said. "Eleanor, there's no shame in being manipulated by someone who claimed to love you. No shame in hoping he would change, in trying to make the best of a bad situation." Eleanor looked at him through her tears, seeing something in his eyes that she hadn't expected, understanding without judgment, compassion without pity. "How do you know so much about this?" she asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Because my father did the same thing to my mother. I watched her make excuses for his anger, his drinking, his fists. I watched her believe it was her fault, that she deserved it." His voice grew hard. "I was 15 when I finally got big enough to stop him. Put him in the hospital and told him if he ever touched her again, I'd kill him." Eleanor stared at him in shock. "What happened?" "He never hit her again, but he found other ways to hurt her words. Isolation, financial control. She never left him, died still married to him and believing she'd failed as a wife." Tom's eyes met Eleanor's. "So when I tell you that staying doesn't make you weak, when I tell you that surviving makes you strong, I know what I'm talking about." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, not shattering, but opening like a flower. For the first time since Doc's revelation, she felt something other than shame and anger. "What do we do now?" she asked. Tom picked up Jake's confession letter from where it had fallen. "Now we decide what justice looks like. Jake Morrison and his friends committed murder and covered it up. The question is whether we let them get away with it." Eleanor thought about the years of abuse, the silence of the community, the lies that had shaped her life since Chester's death. Then she thought about the progress she'd made, the strength she'd found, the love that was growing between her and Tom. "I don't want revenge," she said finally. "I just want the truth to be known. I want people to understand that Chester wasn't the respected rancher they remember. He was a brutal man who got what he deserved." Tom nodded. "We can take this to the sheriff. Let the law handle it." Eleanor looked toward the corral where Diablo grazed peacefully, no longer the wild, broken creature he'd been when Tom arrived. The parallel wasn't lost on her. Sometimes healing meant acknowledging the wounds, not pretending they'd never existed. "Tom," she said quietly. "Yes? Thank you for listening, for understanding, for not trying to fix me or save me or tell me how I should feel." Tom's smile was soft. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth, all of it." As they sat together on the porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, Eleanor realized that Jake's drunken confession had done something unexpected. Instead of destroying the foundation of her new life, it had cleared away the lies and half-truths that had been undermining it. For the first time since Chester's death, Eleanor felt truly free, not because a violent man was gone from her life, but because she finally understood that his violence had never been her fault, his choices had never been her responsibility, and his death had never been something she needed to feel guilty about. The truth, painful as it was, had set her free to build something real with a man who understood that love meant partnership, not possession. And that realization was worth more than all the lies in the world. The revelation of Jake Morrison's confession changed everything on the McAllister ranch, but not in the ways Eleanor had expected. Instead of destroying her newfound sense of self, the truth seemed to liberate her from the guilt and confusion she'd carried for 2 years. She moved through the following days with a clarity of purpose that Tom found both inspiring and slightly intimidating. Her first act was to ride into Esperanza and deliver Jake's confession letter to Sheriff Martinez personally. Tom had offered to accompany her, but Eleanor had declined with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument. "This is something I need to do myself," she'd told him. "For 2 years I've let other people control the narrative of my life. It's time I started writing my own story." When she returned from town that evening, her face was set with grim satisfaction. "Martinez arrested Jake this morning," she reported. "Apparently he was still drunk from the night before and didn't even try to deny what he'd written. The other 2 men involved have been taken into custody as well." Tom nodded, though he could see the toll the day had taken on her. "How do you feel?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Relieved," she said finally, "and angry, and sad, but mostly relieved that the truth is finally out there." Over the next few days, Eleanor made more changes. She rode to town again and met with the banker, transferring a substantial portion of her assets into a fund for the territorial orphanage. When Tom asked about it, she'd simply said, "Blood money needs to do some good in the world." But the most significant change came in her interactions with Tom himself. The careful restraint that had characterized their relationship dissolved overnight, replaced by an openness that took Tom's breath away. Eleanor touched him more frequently, hand on his arm during conversation, fingers brushing his as she passed him coffee. Casual intimacies that spoke of a woman who decided to stop protecting herself from the possibility of love. Tom found himself both exhilarated and terrified by the shift. He'd grown accustomed to the slow pace of their courtship, the careful dance around their mutual attraction. This new directness from Eleanor was forcing him to confront his own fears about opening his heart again. The approaching deadline for Diablo's training added another layer of complexity to their situation. With only 5 days remaining in the month-long challenge, Tom had made unprecedented progress with the Stallion. Diablo accepted a saddle, responded to basic commands, and had even allowed Tom to mount him briefly on 2 occasions. The horse was, by any reasonable measure, tamed. But Tom found himself reluctant to declare victory. Finishing the challenge would mean fulfilling his obligation to Eleanor, which technically would mean leaving the ranch. The thought of riding away from Eleanor, from the life they'd been building together, filled him with a dread that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with loss. Eleanor, for her part, seemed to be thinking along similar lines. She'd taken to watching his training sessions with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every moment, storing up memories against an uncertain future. On the evening of the 26th day, as Tom was grooming Diablo after their session, Eleanor approached the corral with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Tom," she said, "we need to talk." Tom set down the brush and gave Diablo a final pat before joining Eleanor outside the corral. The stallion watched them go with intelligent eyes, as if he understood that important decisions were being made. "I've been thinking about the challenge," Eleanor said without preamble. About what happens when you succeed. Tom felt his heart skip. Eleanor. Let me finish, she said, holding up a hand. When I first issued this challenge, it was about proving something. About showing that Diablo couldn't be broken. That some things in this world are too strong to be conquered by force. Tom nodded, waiting. But you didn't try to break him? Eleanor continued. You showed him respect, earned his trust, proved that partnership is stronger than domination. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Eleanor's smile was radiant. Hope, faith in the possibility that someone can know all my broken places and choose to stay anyway. Tom felt something ease in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. Eleanor. I love you, Tom Brennan, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I love your patience, your gentleness, your strength that doesn't need to prove itself. I love the way you see Diablo not as a problem to be solved, but as a creature deserving of respect. I love the way you've never tried to fix me or save me, just supported me while I found my own way back to myself. Tom stared at her, feeling the walls he'd built around his heart crumble like ancient adobe in a hard rain. I love you too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. More than I thought I'd ever be able to love anyone again. Eleanor stepped closer, her hands coming up to frame his face. Then stay. Don't finish the challenge, if finishing means leaving. Stay and help me run this ranch. Stay and be my partner in all the ways that matter. Tom covered her hands with his, leaning into her touch. What about the people who'll say I took the easy way out? That I quit when the real test came? Eleanor's laugh was fierce. Let them say whatever they want. I've learned that other people's opinions don't determine our worth. Besides, she added with a mischievous smile, I have an idea about that. Before Tom could ask what she meant, Eleanor was kissing him with a passion that made his knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. What kind of idea? Tom managed to ask. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief. What if we turned the completion of the challenge into something bigger? A celebration, a demonstration of what's possible when people choose partnership over domination. Tom felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. What did you have in mind? An exhibition, Eleanor said, her excitement building as she spoke. Invite everyone in the territory to see what you've accomplished with Diablo. Show them that there's more than one way to solve a problem, more than one definition of strength. Tom considered this, seeing the wisdom in her proposal. A public demonstration would prove his success beyond any doubt, while also making a statement about the methods he'd used. And after the demonstration, he asked. Eleanor's smile was soft and sure. After the demonstration, we start planning our wedding. Tom felt his heart stop, then restart at double speed. Wedding? Unless you have objections to marrying a woman with a complicated past and a tendency towards strong opinions. Tom's answer was to pull her close and kiss her until they were both dizzy. When they came up for air, his smile was brighter than she'd ever seen it. Eleanor McAllister, he said, I can't think of anything I'd like more than to spend the rest of my life arguing with you about horse training and ranch management. As they stood together in the gathering dusk, holding each other close and making plans for their future, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above the ranch. Jake Morrison had been released on bail pending his trial, and he was not taking his fall from grace with anything approaching grace. The man who'd once been the terror of the local saloons stood looking down at the couple embracing in the yard, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. In his alcohol-addled mind, all his troubles could be traced back to the arrival of Tom Brennan and his gentle methods with horses. Jake's hand moved to the rifle slung across his saddle, his finger caressing the trigger as he imagined the satisfaction of putting an end to the man who'd made him look like a fool. But even drunk and angry, Jake retained enough sense to know that shooting Tom in cold blood would only make his legal troubles worse. No, if he was going to have his revenge, it would need to look like an accident, and Jake knew exactly how to arrange one. As Tom and Eleanor walked hand in hand toward the house, unaware of the malevolent eyes watching their every move, Jake Morrison began to formulate a plan that would eliminate his rival and restore his reputation in one violent stroke. The final test of Diablo's training was still 3 days away, but Jake had no intention of waiting that long. Tomorrow, while Tom was distracted by his daily routine with the Stallion, Jake would set in motion events that would end with the death of the man who'd stolen his thunder and ruined his life. In the bunkhouse, Tom carefully retrieved the oiled packet from his saddlebag and extracted the letter he'd carried for over a year. Sarah's handwriting was as familiar to him as his own, and for the first time since her death, he felt ready to read her final words to him. The letter was filled with love and everyday details: Emma's progress in school, Sarah's plans for the garden, dreams for their future when Tom returned from deployment. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to his eyes. "My darling Tom, I know this deployment has been hard on you, and I want you to know that Emma and I are so proud of the man you are and the service you're giving. But when you come home, I hope you'll remember that your first duty is to yourself and to us. The world will always need heroes, but Emma and I need our husband and father more than we need another medal on the wall. Come home safe, my love, and let someone else save the world for a while." Tom folded the letter carefully, his heart both broken and healed by Sarah's words. She'd known him well enough to understand his tendency to sacrifice himself for others, and she'd loved him enough to ask him to choose his family over his duty. He'd failed to heed her gentle warning then, but he wouldn't make that mistake again. Eleanor had offered him a chance at a new life, a new love, a new way of being in the world. This time, he would choose the woman who loved him over the abstract call of duty or honor. This time, he would choose to stay. The morning of the exhibition dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made every detail of the landscape stand out in sharp relief. Word of Tom's success with Diablo had spread throughout the territory, and people had been arriving since dawn to witness what many still believed was impossible. Eleanor stood on her porch, watching the crowd gather around the main corral, and felt a mixture of pride and nervousness that made her stomach flutter. She'd spent the past 3 days preparing for this moment, arranging seating, organizing refreshments, and sending word to every ranch and settlement within a day's ride. Sheriff Martinez had arrived early, bringing with him several territorial officials who'd heard about the remarkable horse trainer working on the McAllister ranch. Doc Henderson was there too, his presence a gesture of support that Eleanor appreciated despite their recent difficulties. Even some of the women from town had come, their curiosity overcoming their usual reluctance to attend such masculine entertainments. But it was the presence of the Cowboys that mattered most. Nearly every ranch hand, drifter, and horsebreaker within 50 miles had gathered to see if Tom Brennan could really ride the devil horse that had defeated them all. Their faces showed a mixture of skepticism, hope, and barely concealed resentment that made Eleanor acutely aware of how much was riding on the next hour. Tom emerged from the barn leading Diablo, and a murmur ran through the crowd. The stallion moved with calm confidence, his head high but not aggressive, his powerful body relaxed despite the unusual number of people surrounding his domain. The transformation from the wild, dangerous creature of a month ago was so complete that some of the observers questioned whether this could really be the same horse. "Morning, folks," Tom called out as he approached the corral, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I appreciate you all coming out to see what Diablo and I have been working on." Eleanor noticed how Tom positioned himself confident but not arrogant, respectful of the crowd but not intimidated by their scrutiny. He wore his best shirt and hat for the occasion, and she'd helped him polish his boots until they gleamed. But it was the way he carried himself that caught her attention, the quiet assurance of a man who'd found his place in the world. Tom had strapped on his spurs for the first time since arriving at the ranch, the silver rowels catching the morning light as he moved. Eleanor knew the significance of this choice. The spurs weren't just equipment, they were a symbol of his readiness to fully engage with both his past and his future. "Now, I know most of you have tried your hand with this horse," Tom continued, gesturing toward Diablo, And I know some of you think I've used tricks or shortcuts to get where we are today." A few men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Eleanor spotted Jake Morrison near the back, his face dark with anger and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Truth is," Tom said, "there haven't been any tricks. Just patience, respect, and the understanding that partnership works better than domination. Diablo here isn't broken, he's chose to trust me. That's a different thing entirely." Tom opened the corral gate and led Diablo inside, the stallion following willingly without a lead rope. The crowd fell silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary in that simple display of trust. Eleanor held her breath as Tom began his demonstration, starting with the basic exercises he'd developed over the past month. He showed how Diablo responded to voice commands, how the horse would approach when called, how he accepted grooming and handling without restraint. "The key," Tom explained to the crowd as he worked, "is understanding that fear and anger are usually just pain wearing a disguise. Diablo wasn't mean he was protecting himself the only way he knew how." Eleanor saw several people in the crowd nod at this observation, and she realized that Tom was teaching them about more than just horse training. He was offering a different way of understanding conflict and resistance that went far beyond the corral. When Tom brought out the saddle, a new tension rippled through the gathered observers. This was the moment when most attempts to ride Diablo had ended in disaster, when the horse's true nature had asserted itself with violent consequence. But Diablo stood calmly as Tom placed the blanket on his back, showed no resistance as the saddle followed. When Tom tightened the cinch, the stallion's only reaction was to turn his head and nuzzle Tom's shoulder, a gesture of affection that drew gasps from the crowd. "Now comes the real test," Tom announced, his hand resting on the saddle horn. "Not whether I can force him to accept me, but whether he chooses to carry me as a partner." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as Tom placed his left foot in the stirrup. This was the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the culmination of everything they'd worked toward, the proof that love and patience could indeed triumph over fear and force. Tom's ascent into the saddle was smooth and deliberate, his movements telegraphing his intentions clearly to the horse beneath him. Diablo's ears flicked back and forth, monitoring Tom's position, but there was no tension in the stallion's body, no preparation for the explosive violence that had characterized his previous encounters with riders. When Tom settled fully into the saddle, the silence from the crowd was absolute. Even the children had stopped their chatter, sensing that they were witnessing something momentous. For a long moment, horse and rider simply stood together in the center of the corral, each seeming to take the measure of this new configuration. Then, with the gentlest pressure from Tom's legs, Diablo began to move. Diablo moved with the fluid grace of a creature born to carry riders, his powerful stride eating up the ground as Tom guided him around the perimeter of the corral. The stallion's ears were forward, his head held proudly, and there was something almost joyful in the way he moved, as if he'd finally found the purpose he'd been searching for all his life. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Tom put Diablo through a series of increasingly complex maneuvers. The horse responded to the slightest pressure from Tom's legs, turning, backing, and sidestepping with the precision of a cavalry mount. When Tom asked for a canter, Diablo lifted into the gait with such smoothness that it looked like they were floating above the ground. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the culmination of Tom's patient work. This wasn't just a man riding a horse, it was a perfect partnership between two beings who'd found in each other exactly what they'd been missing. "Well, I'll be damned," she heard Doc Henderson mutter. "Never seen anything like it." The sentiment was echoed throughout the crowd as people began to realize they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. Men who'd been thrown and trampled by this same horse stared in amazement as Diablo performed with the willing enthusiasm of a creature who'd found his calling. Tom brought Diablo to a halt in the center of the corral, the stallions breathing easy despite the exertion. Horse and rider faced the crowd together, and Eleanor could see the deep satisfaction in Tom's face, not the arrogance of conquest, but the quiet joy of a job well done. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed gathering. "I give you Diablo broken, not defeated but willing." The applause that erupted from the crowd was thunderous, drowning out the objections of the few who still insisted that some form of trickery must be involved. Eleanor saw Sheriff Martinez clapping with enthusiasm, his face beaming with the pride of a man who'd backed the right horse from the beginning. But it was the reaction of the other cowboys that mattered most to Eleanor. One by one, the men who'd tried and failed to break Diablo began to nod their approval. They recognized skill when they saw it, even if that skill involved methods they'd never considered. Tom dismounted with the same fluid grace he'd shown throughout the demonstration, and Diablo immediately moved closer to him, clearly seeking the contact and approval of his partner. When Tom scratched behind the stallion's ears, Diablo's obvious pleasure drew another wave of amazed murmurs from the crowd. Eleanor was making her way toward the corral, her heart bursting with pride and love, when the crack of a rifle shot split the morning air. The bullet took Tom high in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to his knees in the dust. Chaos erupted as people screamed and dove for cover. Diablo reared at the sudden violence, his instincts telling him to flee, but instead of bolting, the stallion positioned himself between Tom and the direction the shot had come from, his body shielding his fallen partner. Eleanor's training as a rancher's wife kicked in, and she was moving toward Tom before conscious thought had time to interfere. She reached him just as he was struggling to stand, blood soaking through his shirt and painting his left arm crimson. "Tom!" she cried, her hands fluttering uselessly as she tried to assess the damage. "I'm all right," Tom gasped, though his face was gray with pain. "Just a graze." Sheriff Martinez appeared beside them, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the ridge where the shot had originated. "Jake Morrison," he said grimly. "Saw him up there just before the shot. He's getting away." Eleanor felt a cold fury settle over her as she realized that Jake had tried to murder Tom in front of half the territory. The coward hadn't been content with his confession, and Arez wanted to destroy the man who'd shown him up in the most public way possible. "Get Tom to Doc Henderson," Martinez ordered, already moving toward his horse. "I'm going after Morrison." "No," Tom said, struggling to his feet with Eleanor's help. "This is between him and me. I'll handle it." Martinez shook his head. "You're wounded, Tom. Let me do my job." But Tom was already moving toward his mare, his jaw set with determination despite the blood loss. "Some things can't be handled by the law, Sheriff. Sometimes a man has to settle his own accounts." Eleanor caught his arm. "Tom, you're hurt. You can't." Tom turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her step back. It wasn't anger exactly, but something colder and more dangerous, the look of a man who'd been pushed too far and was finally ready to push back. "He tried to kill me in front of you," Tom said quietly, "in front of everyone we care about. That's not something I can let stand." Eleanor understood then that this wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about Tom finally standing up for something that mattered to him, finally choosing to fight for the life he wanted, rather than simply enduring whatever came his way. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. Tom shook his head. "Eleanor, don't you dare tell me to stay behind," Eleanor interrupted, her voice fierce. "That man has been a poison in this community for years, and it's time someone stood up to him. If you're going, then we're going together." Tom looked at her for a long moment, seeing the steel in her spine and the fire in her eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Together, then." As they mounted their horses, Tom moving stiffly but managing to stay in the saddle, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. For too long, she'd let other people control her story, define her choices, determine her future. Jake Morrison represented everything she'd learned to hate about men who used violence to impose their will on others. It was time to end this, once and for all. Diablo, seemingly understanding that his new partnership with Tom was being threatened, followed without being led, his powerful stride easily keeping pace with the other horses as they set off in pursuit of the man who'd tried to destroy the fragile trust they'd all worked so hard to build. Behind them, the crowd of spectators watched in tense silence, understanding that they'd witnessed not just a demonstration of horse training, but the beginning of a confrontation that would determine the future of everyone involved. 6 months later, Eleanor Brennan stood on the porch of her newly renamed ranch, watching her husband work with a young Mustang that had been brought in the previous week. The Brennan McAllister ranch sign creaked gently in the afternoon breeze, its fresh paint gleaming in the desert sun. The confrontation with Jake Morrison had ended not with violence but with justice. Sheriff Martinez had caught up with the fleeing man before Tom and Eleanor could reach him, finding Jake passed out drunk in a canyon with his rifle beside him. The additional charge of attempted murder had ensured that Jake would spend the next 15 years in territorial prison, far from anyone he could hurt. Tom's shoulder had healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar that Eleanor sometimes traced with her finger during quiet moments. Doc Henderson had done good work, and Tom's natural strength had done the rest. Within a month, he'd been back to full activity, though Eleanor had insisted on doing the heavy lifting around the ranch until she was absolutely certain he was recovered. Their wedding had taken place on a crisp autumn morning, with half the territory in attendance. Sheriff Martinez had given Eleanor away, and Doc Henderson had served as Tom's best manner gesture of reconciliation that had meant more to Eleanor than she could express. Diablo had stood in the corral wearing ribbons in his mane, as if he understood that the day marked the official beginning of the partnership he'd helped create. The ranch itself had prospered under their joint management. Tom's reputation as a horse trainer had spread far beyond New Mexico territory, bringing clients from as far away as California and Texas. Men who'd heard about his methods came to learn not just how to train difficult horses, but how to approach problems with patience rather than force. Eleanor had found her own role in the enterprise, using her business acumen to manage the financial side of their operations, while also developing a program to help other women in situations similar to what she'd experienced with Chester. The ranch had become a haven for those who needed time and space to heal from trauma, both human and equine. Diablo had become something of a legend, his transformation from devil horse to willing partner, inspiring stories that grew in the telling. But more importantly, he'd become Tom's constant companion, the two of them working together with a harmony that never ceased to amaze Eleanor. 6 months later, Eleanor Brennan stood on the porch of her newly renamed ranch, watching her husband work with a young Mustang that had been brought in the previous week. The Brennan McAllister ranch sign creaked gently in the afternoon breeze, its fresh paint gleaming in the desert sun. The confrontation with Jake Morrison had ended not with violence but with justice. Sheriff Martinez had caught up with the fleeing man before Tom and Eleanor could reach him, finding Jake passed out drunk in a canyon with his rifle beside him. The additional charge of attempted murder had ensured that Jake would spend the next 15 years in territorial prison, far from anyone he could hurt. Tom's shoulder had healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar that Eleanor sometimes traced with her finger during quiet moments. Doc Henderson had done good work, and Tom's natural strength had done the rest. Within a month, he'd been back to full activity, though Eleanor had insisted on doing the heavy lifting around the ranch until she was absolutely certain he was recovered. Their wedding had taken place on a crisp autumn morning, with half the territory in attendance. Sheriff Martinez had given Eleanor away, and Doc Henderson had served as Tom's best manner gesture of reconciliation that had meant more to Eleanor than she could express. Diablo had stood in the corral wearing ribbons in his mane, as if he understood that the day marked the official beginning of the partnership he'd helped create. The ranch itself had prospered under their joint management. Tom's reputation as a horse trainer had spread far beyond New Mexico territory, bringing clients from as far away as California and Texas. Men who'd heard about his methods came to learn not just how to train difficult horses, but how to approach problems with patience rather than force. Eleanor had found her own role in the enterprise, using her business acumen to manage the financial side of their operations, while also developing a program to help other women in situations similar to what she'd experienced with Chester. The ranch had become a haven for those who needed time and space to heal from trauma, both human and equine. Diablo had become something of a legend, his transformation from devil horse to willing partner, inspiring stories that grew in the telling. But more importantly, he'd become Tom's constant companion, the two of them working together with a harmony that never ceased to amaze Eleanor. This afternoon, she watched Tom introduce the young Mustang to the same patient methods that had transformed Diablo. The horse was skittish and defensive, clearly having learned to expect cruelty from humans. But Tom approached with the same gentle persistence he brought to everything, his voice soft and his movements deliberate. Eleanor smiled as she recognized the signs of progress, the way the Mustang's ears pricked forward when Tom began to hum. The gradual decrease in the distance the horse maintained between himself and the man who refused to use force. It would take time, as it always did, but Eleanor had learned to appreciate the value of slow, steady progress over quick fixes that didn't last. "Mrs. Brennan?" Eleanor turned to see Maria Santos, one of the women who'd come to stay at the ranch 3 weeks earlier. Maria had fled an abusive marriage in Santa Fe, arriving with nothing but the clothes on her back and a black eye that had made Eleanor's hands clench into fists. "How are you feeling today, Maria?" Eleanor asked, noting the way the young woman's shoulders had straightened during her time at the ranch. "Better," Maria said, and Eleanor could hear the surprise in her voice. "I helped Mr. Tom with the morning feeding, and he said I have a natural way with the horses." Eleanor wasn't surprised. She'd noticed that many of the women who came to the ranch found healing in working with the animals. There was something about caring for creatures who'd also been hurt that seemed to help both species recover their trust in the world. "Tom's usually right about things like that," Eleanor said. "Have you given any thought to what you'd like to do when you're ready to leave?" Maria's face brightened. "Actually, I was hoping I could talk to you about that. I've been thinking I might want to learn more about horse training, maybe start my own business someday." Eleanor felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. This was why she and Tom had expanded their mission beyond simple horse training, because healing came in many forms. And sometimes the best way to recover from being powerless was to learn skills that made you valuable and independent. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Eleanor said. "We can start you with some of the gentler horses, teach you the basics. Tom loves having students who are genuinely interested in learning." As Maria walked back toward the barn with a spring in her step that hadn't been there when she'd arrived, Eleanor reflected on how much her life had changed. The fearful, isolated woman who'd hidden behind walls of pride and pretense was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real strength came from connection rather than independence, from building others up rather than protecting yourself from their potential to hurt you. Tom finished his session with the Mustang and walked toward the house, Diablo following at his shoulder like a devoted friend. Eleanor never tired of watching them together, two beings who'd found in each other exactly what they'd needed to become whole. "How's our new arrival?" Eleanor asked as Tom climbed the porch steps. "Coming along," Tom said, settling beside her on the swing they'd installed last month. "Reminds me of someone I used to know, all bristles and suspicion on the surface, but underneath just scared and wanting to trust again." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and marveling that she'd once thought she was complete on her own. "Think you can help him?" Tom's arm tightened around her. "I think we can help each other. That's usually how it works." Eleanor looked out across their land, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. In the main corral, Diablo grazed peacefully, no longer the wild, broken creature he'd been when Tom first arrived. In the pasture beyond, other horses, some healed, some still healing, moved freely in the growing dusk. "Do you ever miss it?" Eleanor asked. "The army, the excitement, the sense of purpose?" Tom was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I thought purpose was about saving people," he said finally. "Turns out it's more about building something lasting with the people you love." Eleanor turned to look at him, seeing the contentment in his face, the peace that had replaced the haunted look he'd worn when he first rode into her life. "No regrets?" Tom's smile was soft and sure. "Only that it took me so long to understand what really mattered." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor and Tom sat together on their porch, watching their world settle into evening quiet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, horses to train, people to help, a business to run, a life to build together. But tonight was for appreciating how far they'd traveled from the broken, wary individuals who'd found each other in a dusty corral 6 months ago. In the distance, Diablo nickered softly, a sound of pure contentment that seemed to bless the life they'd all built together. And Eleanor Brennan, formerly McAllister, formerly afraid, currently and completely happy, closed her eyes and listened to the sound of home.